Hello everyone. Welcome back to Mr. Nightveil. Tonight we are bringing you 10 of the most disturbing true horror stories ever documented from cruise ships, where the endless ocean becomes an inescapable trap. These are not works of fiction or traveler legends. These are authentic accounts from passengers and crew members who encountered stalkers at sea that forever changed their understanding of reality. Each story has been meticulously compiled from incident reports, witness interviews, and documented evidence that cannot be easily dismissed. Cruise ships carry thousands across miles of open water, where escape is impossible and terror unfolds behind closed doors. If you are drawn to genuine horror content rooted in documented reality, subscribe to Mr. Nightveil and activate the notification bell. After you hear these deeply unsettling accounts tonight, share your own experiences in the comment section below. Now, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we descend into the terror that lurks on ships surrounded by nothing but water. My name is Dana. I'm 28 years old, and I'm a graphic designer from Atlanta. In July 2019, I booked a 7-night Caribbean cruise out of Miami on the oasis of the seas. I needed to escape. After 70-hour work weeks and a brutal breakup that left me couch surfing at my best friend's place, I was desperate for a reset. When I saw the deal online, I didn't think twice. An inside cabin on Deck 9 wasn't glamorous, but I wasn't there for luxury. I was there to disappear. Cabin 9847 became my sanctuary on the first day. Small, windowless, but mine. I could lock the door and shut out the world. The ship was enormous, like a floating city. And I spent that first day exploring the promenade deck, eating too much at the Windjammer buffet, and actually feeling that tension start to melt away. For the first time in months, I slept without my phone alarm waking me up at 5 in the morning. The second night destroyed that peace completely. I woke up at 3 in the morning to absolute darkness. That sounds obvious for an inside cabin with no windows, but this was different. This darkness felt wrong. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick, textured, pressing against my eyes, even though they were open. I blinked hard, trying to adjust, but nothing changed. Then the smell hit me. Old cologne. Medicinal. Like something that had been sitting in a medicine cabinet since the 1970s, mixing with dust and thyme. It made my stomach turn. I sat up in bed, my heart already starting to pound, and reached for the light switch on the wall. My fingers found it, flicked it up. Nothing happened. I tried again. Click, click, click. The darkness stayed absolute. That's when I heard the breathing. It wasn't my breathing. I know because I held my breath to make sure, my lungs burning as I counted to 10 in my head. The breathing continued. Slow, deliberate, coming from the corner of the cabin near the bathroom. Deep inhales through a nose, exhales through slightly parted lips. The sound a person makes when they're standing very still, watching something. My hand shot out to grab my phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up, a tiny rectangle of blue light in the void, and I aimed it toward the corner. There was nothing there. But the breathing didn't stop. I swept the phone light across the entire cabin. Empty. Just my suitcase on the luggage rack, my clothes hanging in the narrow closet, the bathroom door half open. Nobody. But that smell, that medicinal cologne, was stronger now. Suffocating. And the breathing had moved. It was closer to the bed now, right beside me. I lunged for the door, yanked it open, and stumbled into the corridor. The fluorescent lights were harsh after that darkness, making me squint. A couple walking past looked at me strangely. I must have looked insane. Standing there in my pajamas, breathing hard, staring back into my cabin like something was chasing me. But the cabin looked normal now. Light from the hallway spilled in, showing everything exactly as it should be. Empty. Safe. I didn't go back in for 20 minutes. I walked to the Deck 7 promenade instead, found an all-night coffee station, and sat on a bench trying to convince myself I'd been dreaming. Stress does weird things to people. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking. Maybe the breakup had messed me up more than I thought. When I finally went back, I left every light on and barely slept. The next morning, I mentioned it to my cabin steward. His name was Roy, a guy in his early 30s from the Philippines who'd been nothing but friendly during turn-down service the day before. When I described the smell and the darkness, his face changed. The smile dropped. He looked past me into the cabin, then back at me. "This cabin," he said slowly. "Other guests have complained." My stomach dropped. Complained about what? He hesitated, clearly weighing what to say. Strange things. Feelings. One woman requested transfer after one night. Said she couldn't breathe in there. Why didn't anyone tell me this when I checked in? Roy looked uncomfortable. "The ship is full. No cabins to move you to. I will talk to my supervisor." Nothing came of it. I went to guest services myself that afternoon, and they apologized, offered me onboard credit for my trouble, but confirmed what Roy had said. The ship was at capacity. There were no other cabins available. I could either stay in 9847 or... Well, there was no or. I was on a ship in the middle of the ocean. That night, I tried to stay out of the cabin as long as possible. I watched the evening show, ate a late dinner, wandered the casino even though I don't gamble. It was after midnight when I finally forced myself back to Deck 9. The lights in the corridor flickered as I approached my cabin. Once, twice, then steady again. I told myself it was just the ship's electrical system. Old wiring, nothing supernatural about it. I unlocked the door with my cruise card and stepped inside. The temperature hit me first. It was freezing. Actually freezing. My breath came out in visible clouds. The cabin's thermostat was set to 72 degrees, but it felt like 40. I could see frost forming on the mirror above the desk. Then I saw what was on the bed. All of my belongings, every single thing I'd brought, were arranged in a perfect circle on the mattress. My clothes, my toiletries, my books, my laptop. Even the jewelry I'd left in the safe, which was now standing open. Everything placed with mathematical precision, evenly spaced, creating a ring about 4 feet in diameter. I hadn't done that. Nobody had been in my cabin. The door had been locked. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and took pictures. I don't know why. Evidence, maybe. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The photos came out strange, though. There was a blur in every single one, right in the center of the circle. A darkness that my phone's camera couldn't quite capture. It looked like a person-shaped smudge standing in the middle of my belongings. I didn't touch anything. I went straight back to guest services. The night manager, a woman named Hope, actually came back to the cabin with me. When she saw the arrangement, her professional composure cracked for just a second. I saw fear in her eyes before she covered it with corporate concern. "This is highly unusual," she said, which felt like the understatement of the century. "I'm going to check the security footage for your corridor." She left me there with a security officer while she went to review the tapes. I stood in the doorway, refusing to go back inside, while the officer looked around uncomfortably. He was young, maybe 25, and clearly didn't know what to make of the situation. "Has this happened before?" I asked him. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "I've heard stories about this cabin number. Different ships, same number." "What do you mean, different ships?" "Cabin 9847. Something about that number. I don't know the details. Just rumors." Hope came back 15 minutes later. Her face was pale. "The security footage shows you entering your cabin at 6 p.m. for turn-down service, then leaving at 8 p.m. for dinner, then returning just now at 12:30. Nobody else entered. The door never opened." "That's impossible." "I know. She arranged for me to sleep in a crew cabin that night, a tiny room on deck 2 that belonged to a crew member who was on leave. It smelled like industrial detergent and was barely big enough for a twin bed. But I didn't care. I'd sleep in a lifeboat if it meant not going back to 9847. But I had to go back eventually. All my things were still there, still arranged in that perfect, impossible circle. The next morning, with Roy helping me and another steward present, I quickly packed everything I could carry. I refused to stay in that cabin again. They gave me another crew space to use temporarily while they investigated, which I knew meant absolutely nothing would happen. The rest of the cruise was a blur. I couldn't enjoy anything. Every reflection I saw in windows, every shadow on deck, I wondered if it was him. Because by then, I'd done the research. Using the ship's limited internet, I found old news stories. In 1998, a passenger had disappeared from a cabin ending in 847 on a sister ship. Just vanished. The cabin door locked from inside, no sign of struggle. Personal belongings untouched. His name was never released, but witnesses described him as an older man who'd been acting strangely the days before, talking to empty corners, refusing to sleep in his cabin. His body was never found. I counted down the hours until we docked back in Miami. When I finally walked off that ship on disembarkation day, I felt like I could breathe again. I deleted the photos from my phone, tried to forget. But I can't forget. Because last week, I got a notification from the cruise line, a charge to my cruise card, for room service delivery to cabin 9847. Date of service 3 days ago. I haven't been on that ship in over 5 years. I called the cruise line immediately. They insisted it was a billing error, a glitch in their system. They refunded the charge and apologized. But I know what I smelled in that cabin. I know what I heard breathing in the darkness. And I know that whatever was in cabin 9847 isn't bound by locks or doors or even time itself. I still wake up sometimes at 3 in the morning, and for just a second, I smell that medicinal cologne. I hold my breath and listen for breathing that isn't mine. And sometimes, in the absolute darkness behind my closed eyelids, I swear I can feel someone standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching, waiting, with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. My name is Drew. I'm 41 years old, and I teach high school chemistry in Portland, Oregon. In March 2023, I took my family on what was supposed to be a dream vacation, a 7-night Mexican Riviera cruise on the Carnival Vista departing from Los Angeles. My wife Nicole and I had been planning this trip for 2 years, saving up so we could take our 2 kids, ages 9 and 12, somewhere special during spring break. We booked a balcony cabin on deck 8, cabin number 8456, and I remember feeling proud that we could afford it. The ocean view felt like proof that all those extra tutoring sessions and summer school gigs had been worth it. The first day was perfect. We explored the ship, the kids went wild at the water slides, and Nicole and I actually relaxed for the first time in months. That evening, we were sitting in the Deck 10 observation lounge, watching the sunset over the Pacific, when a man approached our table. He was maybe late 50s, wearing a gray business suit which seemed bizarrely formal for a cruise ship where everyone else was in shorts and flip-flops. He smiled and said hello, then proceeded to name each member of my family correctly. Drew, Nicole, both my kids by their first names. I was confused but tried to be polite. Maybe he'd overheard us talking. Maybe we'd met him during the muster drill and I'd forgotten. But Nicole's face told me she didn't recognize him either. When I asked how he knew us, he just smiled wider and said he made it his business to know interesting people. Then he walked away, leaving behind the overwhelming smell of hand sanitizer, so strong it made my eyes water. That night, looking through the photos we'd taken on deck, I noticed him, in the background of every single family picture, standing near the railing, partially hidden behind a pillar. Always there, always watching our direction. I showed Nicole and she laughed it off. Coincidence. The ship had over 4,000 passengers. Of course, some people would appear in multiple photos. But the next morning at breakfast, he was at the buffet line directly behind us. When we went to the pool at 2 in the afternoon, he was in a deck chair 3 rows away, not swimming, not reading, just sitting there in that same gray suit despite the heat. When we attended the early dinner seating at 7, he was seated 4 tables over, and I caught him staring at us at least a dozen times throughout the meal. I started to feel uncomfortable. More than uncomfortable. The air around him seemed wrong somehow, thicker, harder to breathe. Every time he got close, I felt pressure in my chest, like the cabin was losing oxygen. Nicole noticed it too, but didn't say anything in front of the kids. On the 3rd day, something happened that made my blood run cold. We'd planned to sleep in, but I woke up early and couldn't fall back asleep. So I went to the gym on deck 12 at 6 in the morning. The ship's fitness center was nearly empty. Just me, one other guy on a treadmill, and the man in the gray suit, standing on an elliptical machine but not moving, not exercising, just standing there, hands on the handles, watching me in the mirror. I left within 5 minutes and went back to the cabin. When I walked in, Nicole was awake, looking shaken. She'd had a nightmare that someone was in our room, standing over the kids' beds. But when she turned on the light, nobody was there. I didn't tell her about the gym. That afternoon, something was slipped under our cabin door while we were at lunch. I found it when we returned. A printed document, the kind you'd get from a ship's business center. It was our family's schedule for the entire cruise, accurate down to 15-minute increments. What time we woke up, what time we ate breakfast, when the kids went to the youth program, when Nicole visited the spa, when I went to the gym. Everything we'd done for the past 3 days, documented with timestamps. At the bottom, written in red ink, "You follow predictable patterns. This makes observation efficient." My hands shook holding that paper. Nicole saw it and went pale. We immediately took it to ship security. The officer who met with us was professional but clearly skeptical. He asked if we'd had any direct confrontation with this man. I said no, just the initial weird introduction and the constant presence. He said without a direct threat or physical interaction, there wasn't much they could do. They'd keep an eye out and increase patrols near our cabin. That night, neither Nicole nor I could sleep. We lay in the dark, listening to the mechanical hum of the ship, and I kept thinking about that schedule. How had he known? Our cabin was supposed to be private. Had he been tracking us somehow? Was there a camera? I got up and searched every inch of that room with my phone's flashlight. Nothing. Around 3 in the morning, our cabin phone rang. The old-fashioned landline built into the wall. I picked it up and said hello. Nobody spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end. Slow, measured breaths. Then a voice, calm and emotionless. Your daughter went to the bathroom at 2:47. Your son rolled over in his sleep at 3:02. You're searching the cabin at 3:14. I'm very thorough, Drew. I slammed the phone down and immediately called security again. They came to our cabin, checked the phone logs, and found no record of an incoming call. The system showed our phone hadn't rung at all in the past 8 hours. The next day was Cabo San Lucas, our only port stop. Nicole and I made a split-second decision. We'd get off the ship with the kids, find the port authority, and demand help. We'd fly home if we had to. Anything to get away from this nightmare. We deliberately changed our plans at the last minute. Instead of the beach excursion we'd booked, we grabbed the kids right after breakfast and headed to a different tender boat going to a different beach on the opposite side of the bay. We didn't tell anyone. We just went. The beach was beautiful, relatively empty, and for about an hour I actually started to relax. The kids were building sandcastles. Nicole was reading under an umbrella. The sun was warm and the water was clear, and I thought maybe we'd actually escaped him. Then I saw the gray suit. He was sitting in a beach chair that I knew had been empty 30 seconds earlier. But now he was there, wearing the exact same outfit. Not a grain of sand on him despite the beach. And he was wearing swim trunks. Not just any swim trunks. The exact same pattern and color as the ones I was wearing. The ones I'd bought specifically for this trip at a Portland surf shop 2 months ago. He waved at me, a small, deliberate wave. Then he spoke, and even though he was 20 feet away, I heard him perfectly clearly over the sound of the waves. You can't surprise me, Drew. I've been you longer than you have. My chest tightened. The air felt wrong again, that same pressure, that same difficulty breathing. Nicole grabbed my arm, and I realized I was walking toward him without meaning to. She pulled me back. We're leaving, she said. Right now. We gathered the kids, who complained but obeyed when they saw how serious we were, and we headed back to the tender dock. The whole walk back, I felt him behind us. I didn't turn around to look. I didn't want to confirm it. On the ship, we went straight to the guest services desk and demanded to speak to the highest-ranking officer available. We got the cruise director, a woman in her 40s who listened to our story with increasing concern. She pulled up something on her computer, frowned, and excused herself. When she came back 15 minutes later, she had a security officer with her. We've reviewed all security footage from the past 4 days, she said carefully. We cannot find any passenger or crew member matching the description you've provided. The man in the gray suit does not appear on any camera at any time in any location you've described. That's impossible, I said. He's everywhere. Other people must have seen him. They interviewed other passengers from the observation lounge, the buffet, the pool area. Nobody remembered seeing a man in a gray suit. Not one person. That final night, back in our cabin with the door locked and a chair wedged under the handle, something appeared on our television. The screen turned on by itself, showing not a channel, but a live feed. Of our cabin, from an angle that showed all 4 of us clearly. The timestamp in the corner showed the current time. Then the feed switched to footage of our house back in Portland, our actual house, the living room, the kitchen, our bedrooms, all empty but unmistakably ours. Text appeared on the screen. See you at home, Drew. Or should I say, see me at home. We didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, we were first off the ship during disembarkation. We drove straight home from Los Angeles, a 15-hour trip, barely stopping. When we walked into our house, everything was exactly as we'd left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing moved. But on our dining room table was a printed document, our fingerprints, detailed medical records we'd never authorized, DNA profiles for all four of us. And at the bottom, a notation in clinical text. Replacement Integration Study, Family Unit 2847. Progress, 94% complete. Timeline, operational within 6 months. I called the police. They took the document as evidence, but seemed baffled. No crime had technically been committed. No one had broken into our home. The security system showed no unauthorized entry. That was 7 months ago. We've moved since then. Different city, different state, unlisted address. We don't take vacations anymore. We barely leave the house. Because sometimes, late at night, I look at Nicole sleeping beside me and I wonder if she's really Nicole. Sometimes I watch my kids playing and I search their faces for proof that they're actually mine. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something in my own eyes that I don't recognize. A calculation, an observation, like I'm studying myself from the outside. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I'm Drew or if I'm the thing that's been watching Drew, learning Drew, becoming Drew. And the worst part is, I'm starting to forget which one I was supposed to be. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you so closely that they knew you better than you knew yourself? Have you ever looked at your own reflection and wondered if the person staring back was really you? Tell me in the comments, because I need to know if I'm the only one experiencing this, or if there are others out there who understand what it means to lose yourself to someone else's observation. My name is Nightveil. I'm 22 years old. And until October 2021, I worked as a youth counselor aboard the Norwegian Escape. I was fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education, and the cruise line job seemed like an adventure before settling into a real teaching position. The pay wasn't great, but I got to travel, meet people from all over the world, and work with kids, which I loved. I shared a tiny staff cabin on Deck 2 with 3 other counselors, and I was dating another crew member named Kenzo, who bartended at the Sky Bar on Deck 15. Life felt exciting and full of possibility. The cruise departing New York on October 28th was Halloween-themed. The ship was decorated with fake cobwebs, plastic skeletons, and orange lights everywhere. Passengers wore costumes to dinner. The kids' program had special spooky activities planned all week. It should have been fun. Instead, it became the worst week of my life, and the reason I'll never set foot on a cruise ship again. It started on day 3, during what should have been a routine afternoon shift. I was cleaning up the youth center after arts and crafts when I found a note tucked inside my staff locker in the back room. The paper was stiff and stained with something dark brown that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The message was written in shaky handwriting. I see you in the Coral Court. You're next. My stomach dropped. The Coral Court was one of the ship's specialty restaurants on Deck 7, and I'd eaten there once during crew appreciation night. But the note felt threatening in a way I couldn't quite explain. I showed it to my supervisor, who dismissed it as a Halloween prank. Ships always got weird during themed cruises, she said. People took things too far, trying to be scary. I tried to believe her. But that night, I heard rumors spreading through the crew areas. Someone had found blood in the Coral Court after the dinner service ended. Not a lot, just a smear on the wall near the kitchen entrance, but enough that security had cordoned off the area and questioned the restaurant staff. Management was keeping it quiet from passengers, but crew members talk and word travels fast on a ship. The next morning, one of my fellow youth counselors didn't show up for her shift. Catherine was always early, always prepared. And when she didn't answer her cabin phone or respond to radio calls, people started to worry. By noon, security was involved. By evening, they were searching the entire ship. I was the one who found her cruise card. I was walking through a crew corridor on deck 3, heading back to my cabin after my shift ended, when I saw it on the floor near the laundry room entrance. Catherine's ID card, the one we all wore on lanyards around our necks, the one that opened our cabin doors and tracked our movements throughout the ship. It was smeared with blood, and when I picked it up, it was still warm, as if someone had just dropped it seconds before I arrived. My hands shook as I radioed security. They came immediately, sealed off the corridor, and started reviewing camera footage. I gave a statement, but I could barely focus because all I could think about was that note. "You're next." Catherine had been next, and now she was missing. Kenzo found me in my cabin 2 hours later. I was sitting on my bunk, hugging my knees, trying not to panic. He sat beside me and held my hand, and for a few minutes I felt slightly safer. Then he told me what he'd heard from the security team. 3 crew members were missing now. Not just Catherine. 2 others from different departments, all disappeared within the past 24 hours, all with no explanation. And there was footage from the security cameras that nobody could explain. A figure in a plague doctor mask, the kind with the long curved beak, had been spotted in restricted crew areas. Not passenger areas where costumes were expected, but behind locked doors where only crew had access. The figure appeared on camera following Catherine into a stairwell. Then the cameras went dark for exactly 4 minutes. When they came back online, Catherine was gone and the figure had vanished. Kenzo wanted to investigate. I told him it was a terrible idea, that we should let security handle it. But he insisted. He'd been working cruise ships for 5 years and knew every hidden corner, every restricted area, every place where someone could hide. "We had to do something," he said. "We couldn't just wait for more people to disappear." Against my better judgment, I agreed to help. We started near the Coral Court, following a hunch that whatever was happening was connected to that restaurant. The area was still cordoned off, but Kenzo had a master key card from his manager, the kind that opened almost any door. We slipped past the security tape at 2 in the morning when the corridors were mostly empty. The smell hit us first. Something sweet and rotten, like fruit left in the sun too long, mixed with the metallic stench of a butcher shop. It was coming from the cold storage area adjacent to the restaurant's main kitchen. Kenzo pulled his shirt up over his nose and pushed open the heavy door. What we found inside made me vomit immediately. Catherine's body was arranged on the floor among decorative coral pieces stolen from the ship's aquarium displays. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, and her throat had been cut so deeply I could see bone. She wasn't alone. 2 other crew members I recognized, a server and a maintenance worker, were positioned nearby in similar conditions. The coral had been arranged around them like they were exhibits in some sick underwater museum. I was screaming. I don't remember starting. But suddenly I was screaming and Kenzo was pulling me backward and someone was behind us. I turned and saw the plague doctor mask, those empty black eye holes and that grotesque beak, and beneath it a body dressed in ship crew uniform. The person was holding an industrial kitchen knife, the kind we used to cut through frozen meat, and it was covered in blood. Kenzo shoved me toward the door and yelled at me to run. I stumbled backward, and he stayed between me and the attacker, grabbing a steel serving tray from a nearby shelf to use as a shield. The knife came down, and I heard metal on metal, a horrible scraping sound. And then Kenzo was shouting at me again to get help. I ran. I ran through the kitchen, through the restaurant, into the main corridor, screaming for security. My voice was raw and my lungs burned, and I kept slipping on the polished floor in my crew sneakers. Someone finally heard me. A security officer came running from the other direction, radio already at his mouth, calling for backup. We rushed back together. More officers arrived within minutes. They found Kenzo on the floor of the cold storage area, bleeding from a deep wound across his chest and shoulder. The attacker was gone, disappeared into the maze of service corridors that run throughout the ship like veins. The bodies were real. The blood was real. Everything I'd seen was horribly, impossibly real. They airlifted Kenzo off the ship when we reached the nearest port the next morning. The wound had severed muscle and nicked an artery. He survived the emergency surgery but lost significant blood. The doctors said if we'd found him 10 minutes later, he wouldn't have made it. The attacker was identified within hours. His name was Sincere, a former excursion coordinator who'd been fired 6 months earlier for aggressive behavior and policy violations. He'd somehow obtained fake credentials and boarded the ship in New York, hiding in crew areas and picking off staff members who he blamed for his termination. Security found him in a maintenance shaft on Deck 1, still wearing the mask, still holding the knife. He didn't resist arrest. He actually smiled when they handcuffed him. During the interrogation, he explained everything calmly. He said each victim had disrespected the ocean by promoting shore excursions that damaged coral reefs and marine ecosystems. He saw himself as an environmental avenger. The coral arrangements were symbolic. The Halloween cruise was just convenient timing that let him blend in with the costumed passengers. 4 crew members dead. Kenzo permanently scarred, physically and mentally. And me, unable to close my eyes without seeing Catherine's face, without smelling that sweet rot, without hearing the scrape of that knife against metal. Sincere was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Maritime law meant federal charges, serious prison time. But in the courtroom, when they showed his photo on the screen, he was smiling. The same smile he'd worn during arrest, like he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. I quit the cruise industry the day after we docked. I moved back home to Phoenix and took a job at a landlocked elementary school where the closest thing to water is the drinking fountain. Kenzo recovered physically, but we don't talk anymore. Too many bad memories attached to each other. Last I heard, he'd moved to Colorado, as far from the ocean as possible. I can't look at aquariums anymore. Can't watch nature documentaries about coral reefs. The sight of anything decorative made from sea life makes my skin crawl and my heart race. And every year, on October 28th, I have nightmares about cold storage rooms and plague masks and the sound of someone breathing behind a costume that hides a monster. Have you ever worked a job where you felt unsafe? Where something was wrong but nobody believed you until it was too late? Have you ever ignored a warning sign because you thought you were overreacting, only to discover your instincts were right? Tell me your story. Because sometimes the scariest part isn't the danger itself. It's realizing you knew something was wrong all along. My name is Maximilian. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a software developer for a tech company in Seattle. In September 2018, I booked myself onto the Celebrity Eclipse for a transatlantic crossing from Southampton to New York. It was supposed to be a digital detox, 2 weeks at sea with limited internet. Time to think and maybe find inspiration for a project I'd been stuck on for months. I chose an ocean view cabin on Deck 6, cabin number 6123, specifically because it had a window. I wanted to watch the Atlantic, to see nothing but water for days at a time. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would clear my head. I was wrong about everything. The first 3 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I read books I'd been meaning to finish for years. I sat on deck and watched the horizon. I ate meals without checking my phone every 5 minutes. But on day 4, something shifted. We were fully at sea by then. No land visible in any direction. Just endless gray water stretching to meet gray sky. That morning, during the mandatory muster drill, I experienced the strangest sensation. Standing there in my life jacket, listening to the crew explain emergency procedures, I had the overwhelming conviction that I'd done this exact thing before. Not just a similar drill, but this precise moment. The crew members' words, the way sunlight hit the deck, the smell of salt and diesel fuel, even the positions of other passengers around me. All of it felt like a memory I was living through again. I shook it off as déjà vu, that common brain glitch everyone experiences occasionally. But the feeling didn't fade. It intensified. At lunch, I ordered a sandwich I'd never tried before. And the moment I tasted it, I knew exactly how it would taste. Not because I'd had similar food, but because I'd eaten this specific sandwich before. The texture, the flavor, the slight sogginess of the bread where the tomato had leaked through. I knew it all. That evening at the main dining room, I met a woman who introduced herself as Heidi. She was sitting alone at a table near the window. And when I walked past, she looked up at me with an expression of profound relief mixed with exhaustion. She asked if I'd sit with her, said she needed to talk to someone who might understand. There was something desperate in her voice that made me agree, even though I'd planned to eat alone. Heidi told me she'd been on this cruise dozens of times. Not similar cruises, but this exact sailing. The Celebrity Eclipse, Transatlantic, September, Southampton to New York. She said she'd been trapped in some kind of loop for what felt like months, maybe longer. She'd lost count of how many times she'd experienced these same 2 weeks. Every time the ship docked in New York, she'd wake up back in Southampton on embarkation day, and it would all start over. I thought she was joking at first, or maybe mentally unwell. But she started describing things that hadn't happened yet. She told me that in 40 minutes, the captain would make an announcement about tomorrow's weather. She told me exactly what he'd say, word for word. She told me that a waiter named Memphis would drop a tray of glasses in the galley at 8:15, and we'd hear the crash from the dining room. She told me what I'd order for dessert before I'd even looked at the menu. Everything she predicted came true, exactly as she described. We spent the next 2 hours in the observation lounge while she explained her theory. Something about this particular route, these specific coordinates in the Atlantic, attracted what she called temporal attention. The ship crossed the same water, followed the same path, and somehow that created a fold in time. She and I, and possibly others, were caught in it. Aware of the repetition while everyone else lived it for the first time, oblivious. I wanted to dismiss it as elaborate nonsense, but I couldn't ignore the evidence. The déjà vu I'd been experiencing all day suddenly made terrible sense. And as the evening progressed, I started having memories of things that hadn't happened yet in this timeline. Conversations I'd have tomorrow. A book I'd read on deck 10. A storm that would hit on day 8. All of it felt like recollection rather than premonition. That night, I barely slept. I kept having dreams that felt more like memories. Different versions of this cruise, slight variations. In one, I'd chosen the early dinner seating instead of late. In another, I'd booked an inside cabin instead of ocean view. But always the same route, always the same ship, always the same feeling of being observed. The next morning, I found Heidi at breakfast and told her about the dreams. She nodded like she'd expected this. She said it gets worse the longer you're aware. The boundaries between iterations start to blur. You remember things from loops that haven't happened yet in your personal timeline, or have already happened, but differently. She showed me a notebook she'd been keeping, pages and pages of observations, diagrams of the ship, dates written and crossed out. September 2016, September 2017, September 2018. Different years, same cruise. She asked if I'd noticed the food. I hadn't paid attention, but when she pointed it out, I realized she was right. Everything tasted identical regardless of what I ordered. Not similar, but exactly the same. A specific flavor I couldn't quite identify or describe, but one that felt deeply familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Like I'd been tasting it my entire life without realizing. Over the next few days, more passengers started experiencing the same symptoms Heidi and I had. A retired couple from Toronto mentioned persistent déjà vu. A businessman from London said he kept having dreams about drowning that felt like memories. A college student from Boston swore she'd lived this week before. Heidi kept a list of everyone who seemed aware, watching to see if the pattern held across iterations. But it was the ship itself that disturbed me most. Once you started paying attention, you noticed things. The engine vibrations followed a rhythm that felt intentional, almost like communication. If you listened carefully at night, the pattern spelled out words in Morse code. I spent an entire evening with headphones on, recording the vibrations, translating them. Over and over, the same message. Observe, observe, observe. On day 9, we reached the coordinates Heidi had marked in her notebook. The spot where a luxury liner had disappeared in 1952. Vanished without distress call or wreckage. 400 souls lost to the Atlantic without explanation. The celebrity eclipse slowed as we passed through that area, and that's when things became impossible to rationalize. I was on my cabin balcony, watching the water, when gravity stopped working correctly. Not entirely, but enough to notice. My coffee mug lifted slightly from the table. My hair felt lighter. When I looked down, I could see the ocean, but the perspective was wrong. It looked like we were much higher than we should be, or much lower, or both simultaneously. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were showing me. Then I saw them. Other ships. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. All the same model as the celebrity eclipse, all stacked in space that shouldn't exist, occupying the same area without touching, like layers of reality pressed together. All of them were crossing this exact point at this exact moment. And through the windows of those other ships, I could see passengers who looked just like me, standing on balconies, staring out at the impossible sight. Heidi appeared beside me, though I hadn't heard her enter my cabin. She looked tired, more tired than any human should look and still be standing. She pointed down at the water and told me to really look. I did, and I wished I hadn't. Something was rising from beneath the ship. Not a whale or submarine or any creature I had reference for. It was vast, so large that what I could see was clearly just a fraction of the whole. The visible portion was an eye, though calling it an eye feels inadequate. It was the size of the entire ship's hull, and it looked directly at us with an intelligence that was utterly alien. The geometry of it hurt to perceive. Angles that shouldn't connect did connect. Colors that shouldn't exist were there anyway. My nose started bleeding, and I realized I was crying without having felt the tears start. Heidi spoke quietly beside me. She said we were being studied. The entity, or whatever it was, had been dreaming this cruise into existence repeatedly, examining us, learning from us. We were caught in its attention, and every time it forgot, we reset. And when it remembered us again, the dream would start over. We were the recurring dream of something vast and incomprehensible, and we had no way to wake up. The moment stretched. Time felt elastic, pulling and compressing. I could taste salt water in my mouth, even though my cabin was dry. The air smelled like copper and ozone, like lightning striking metal. And through it all, that eye watched us with patient, eternal curiosity. Then I was waking up in Southampton. September 2019. Embarkation day. My luggage was packed beside my hotel bed, and I had a confirmation email for the Celebrity Eclipse transatlantic crossing. I had no memory of the crossing I'd just described, no conscious recollection of meeting Heidi or seeing the impossible eye beneath the ship. But in my luggage, I found a notebook I didn't remember packing. Page after page of my own handwriting, describing everything I've just told you. Warnings to myself. Detailed accounts of multiple iterations. The most recent entry, dated just hours before according to the timestamp, said simply, "This is crossing number 17. You will not remember. You never do. But you always write it down. You always find this notebook. And you always board the ship anyway. Something compels you. Something wants you there. Do not board. Please, for once, do not board." I read that warning sitting in my hotel room in Southampton. I read it 3 times. I felt the truth of it even without memory to support it. Every logical part of my brain screamed at me to cancel, to fly home immediately, to stay as far from the Celebrity Eclipse as possible. But I went to the port anyway. I checked in. I boarded. I found cabin 6123 and unpacked my things. And as I stood at my window watching the ship pull away from Southampton, I felt the overwhelming certainty that I'd done this before and would do it again. I still work in Seattle. I still develop software. But every September, I receive a booking confirmation I don't remember making. For a transatlantic cruise I have no conscious memory of taking. And every year, despite the notebook I find in my luggage covered in warnings, despite the persistent feeling that something is terribly wrong, I board that ship. Because whatever is beneath the Atlantic hasn't finished studying me yet. And until it does, I'll keep dreaming its dream, crossing those same coordinates, providing observation data for something that exists outside the normal flow of time. Have you ever felt trapped in a routine so repetitive it stopped feeling like choice? Have you ever done something over and over, knowing it was wrong but unable to stop yourself? Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt like your life was repeating, because I need to know if anyone else understands what it's like to be caught in someone else's dream with no way to wake up. My name is Regina. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a marine biologist specializing in whale migration patterns. In June 2015, I booked a solo trip on the Ruby Princess for an Alaska cruise departing from Seattle. I'd just called off my wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony, and I needed to be somewhere far away from sympathy texts and awkward conversations with mutual friends. The cruise was supposed to be a consolation prize to myself, a way to combine heartbreak recovery with actual research I could use for my doctorate program. I'd booked a mini suite on Deck 11, cabin 11,009, which felt extravagant but necessary. If I was going to fall apart, I wanted to do it somewhere with a decent view and enough space to spread out my field notes. The first day was exactly what I needed. The air was clean and cold, the scenery was stunning, and nobody on board knew anything about my failed relationship or my current state of emotional disaster. I set up my laptop in the cabin, organized my research materials about humpback whale populations in Alaskan waters, and actually felt something like peace for the first time in weeks. That evening, I found the first letter. It was slipped under my cabin door while I was at dinner, written on ship stationery in elegant cursive handwriting that looked like it came from another era. The paper itself was strange, yellowed and brittle like it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. The letter was addressed to "My Dearest L," and the content was intensely romantic. Talking about watching L from afar, about not being able to approach directly, but feeling connected across distance. It was signed Eternally J and dated June 1994. I assumed it was delivered to the wrong cabin, some kind of mix-up with room numbers. But when I checked the envelope, it had 11,009 written clearly on the outside. I mentioned it to my cabin steward the next morning, a friendly woman named Nina, who'd been with Princess Cruises for over a decade. When I showed her the letter, her expression changed completely. The professional smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked like concern mixed with fear. She asked if she could keep the letter, said she needed to report it to her supervisor. I said sure, figuring it was just protocol for misdelivered items. But before she left, she paused at the door and asked me carefully if I'd experienced anything else unusual in the cabin. Strange sounds, odd smells, feelings of being watched. I said no, and she nodded but didn't look reassured. The second letter appeared that night. I'd stayed out late, watching a comedy show in the main theater and then having drinks at one of the bars, deliberately avoiding my cabin as long as possible, because Nina's questions had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. When I finally returned around midnight, another envelope was waiting under my door. Same yellowed paper, same elegant handwriting, dated June 1994. This letter was more specific, describing Lee's daily activities in detail. Morning coffee on the balcony, afternoon reading in deck chairs, evening walks around the promenade deck. The descriptions matched exactly what I'd done that day, even though the letter was supposedly written 21 years earlier. My hands were shaking as I read it. The letter ended with a line that made my blood run cold. I know you feel me near you, Elle. I know you sense my presence even when you cannot see me. We are connected across time and distance. Nothing, not even death, can sever what we share. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed with all the lights on, trying to rationalize what was happening. Someone was clearly watching me and writing these letters as some kind of sick prank. But the paper, the aged quality of it, the specific date of 1994, none of that made sense with the prank theory. And there was something else. Something I couldn't quite articulate. The handwriting felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, like I'd seen it before in dreams I couldn't quite remember. The next morning, I went looking for information. The ship had a small library and historical display area, and I spent 3 hours going through archived materials and old passenger records that were kept for the ship's anniversary celebrations. What I found made everything infinitely worse. In June 1994, a passenger named Lydia Holbrook had died on this ship during an Alaska cruise. She was 29 years old, a marine biologist researching whale populations. The report said she'd fallen from her Deck 11 balcony in the middle of the night. Her body was recovered from the water the next morning. The death was ruled accidental, possibly suicide, though the investigation was inconclusive. I found a photograph from the cruise archives. Lydia had dark hair cut in a style popular in the 90s, high cheekbones, and a slight build. We didn't look identical, but the resemblance was striking enough to be deeply uncomfortable. Same profession, same research focus, same general appearance, same deck-level cabin. The archive materials mentioned that Lydia had been traveling with her partner, an entertainment director named Jaime who worked on the ship. After her death, Jaime had left the cruise industry entirely. There were old crew testimonials about how devastated he'd been, how he'd insisted her death wasn't accidental, that something on the ship had targeted her. Management had dismissed his claims as grief-induced paranoia. I felt sick reading this. The letters signed J suddenly had a source, and it wasn't a romantic one. It was obsessive, possessive, the kind of attention that doesn't stop just because someone dies. That afternoon, I started having dreams even though I wasn't asleep. Not hallucinations exactly, but vivid flashes of memory that weren't mine. I could taste champagne and strawberries, even though I'd never liked strawberries and hadn't drunk champagne in months. I could feel the texture of a silk dress against my skin, even though I was wearing jeans and a sweater. And underlying everything was the sensation of being watched, of eyes tracking my every movement with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. The third letter appeared during dinner. I'd left my cabin at 6 and returned at 8:30, and it was waiting for me. This one was more desperate, the handwriting shakier, dated June 15th, 1994, which, according to the accident report, was the night Lydia died. The letter begged Elle to remember, to see, to understand that they were still connected. It said, "I'm still here. I never left. We can still be together if you just remember who you are." I couldn't stay in that cabin anymore. I grabbed my jacket and went up to the observation deck on deck 14, needing cold air and open space. It was nearly 10 at night, and we were cruising through Glacier Bay, the scenery spectacular even in the fading light. Ice cliffs rose hundreds of feet above the water, and the ship had slowed to navigate carefully through the floating ice chunks. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the railing about 30 feet away, wearing clothes that were wrong for the current decade. High-waisted jeans, an oversized sweater with shoulder pads, hair styled in that specific mid-90s way. She was staring at the glaciers, and even from a distance, I recognized her from the photograph. Lydia Holbrook, who had been dead for 21 years, standing on the deck as solid and real as any living passenger. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She turned slowly, as if she felt my stare, and looked directly at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the wind and the ship's engines. But I understood them anyway. "He's coming for you. He thinks you're me." The temperature dropped so suddenly it felt like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost formed on the metal railing under my hands. The wind picked up, screaming across the deck with a sound that was almost like voices, and I smelled his cologne. Old-fashioned, overpowering, mixed with something underneath that smelled like decay, like something that should be buried but wasn't. He appeared between me and the door, back inside. Not gradually, not walking up. Just suddenly present, wearing a staff uniform from the 90s, his face unchanged by time because time had stopped for him 21 years ago. Jaime looked at me with eyes that were empty of everything except obsessive need. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Lydia," he said, and his voice was wrong, layered with static like a bad recording. "Darling, you came back. I knew you would. I've been waiting so long." He moved toward me, and I backed up against the railing, the cold metal pressing into my spine. Behind me was a 70-foot drop to freezing water. In front of me was something that used to be human, but wasn't anymore, reaching out with hands that passed through the air like smoke before solidifying. "We can finally be together," Jaime said, still moving closer. "Just step over the railing. Come with me. The water isn't cold once you're under. I promise it doesn't hurt after the first minute." His hand touched my arm, and it burned with cold so intense it felt like fire. I could see his fingers sinking into my sleeve, and where they touched, my skin turned gray and dead-looking. He was pulling me toward the railing, and I couldn't resist, couldn't find the strength to fight back. Part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, but the rest was drowning in memories that weren't mine. Falling, the shock of cold water, lungs filling, darkness closing in. Lydia's death played out in my head like I'd experienced it firsthand. The ship's horn blasted, so loud and sudden that I felt it in my chest like a physical blow. The sound broke something in the moment. Jaime's grip loosened, his form flickering like a bad projection, and I shoved myself sideways, away from the railing, scrambling across the deck on hands and knees. Security officers were running toward me, radios crackling, responding to what must have looked like a suicide attempt or medical emergency. Behind them, other passengers were gathering, pointing, worried faces asking if I was okay. I looked back at where Jaime had been standing, but there was nothing there. No ghost, no apparition, just empty deck space and confused tourists wondering why I was on the ground, hyperventilating. They took me to the medical center, checked me for hypothermia since my skin was dangerously cold despite the relatively mild evening. The doctor couldn't explain my condition, but treated me anyway. Warming blankets and hot drinks until my core temperature returned to normal. When I told them what I'd seen, they exchanged looks that told me they thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Grief, stress, too much alcohol, even though I'd only had one drink at dinner. But Nina, my cabin steward, came to check on me in the medical center. She sat beside my bed and told me quietly that she believed me. She said she'd worked this ship for 11 years and had heard stories about Deck 11, about Lydia, about passengers who resembled her experiencing strange things. Management never acknowledged it officially, but crew members knew. They always knew. I finished the cruise, but I moved to a different cabin on a different deck, and I didn't go near the railing on Deck 11 again. When we docked in Seattle, I gathered every letter Jaime had written and took them with me. I still have them, locked in a safety deposit box, because something about throwing them away felt dangerous, like it might invite his attention again. That was 9 years ago. I'm married now, to someone kind and alive, and very much in the present. I have 2 kids, ages 4 and 6. We live in Tucson, about as far from the ocean as you can get in the continental United States. I finished my doctorate but changed my focus away from marine biology. I work in freshwater ecosystems now, studying desert streams and landlocked species. But every year, on June 15th, I receive mail. A single letter, handwritten in elegant cursive on yellowed paper that smells faintly of old cologne. It's always the same message, dated 1994, signed by J. Thank you for not joining us, L. You chose life, and I'm grateful even in my loneliness. Love endures across death, but so does the pain of separation. I still watch the railing where I lost her, where I lost you, where I lost everything. Some loves refuse to die, even when they should. I never open them anymore. My husband takes them straight from the mailbox to the shredder. But before he destroys them, I always catch a glimpse of the return address, and it's always the same. Deck 11, Cabin 11,009, Ruby Princess, at sea. Have you ever felt a connection to someone you've never met? Like you were living out their story instead of your own? Have you ever visited a place that felt familiar even though you'd never been there before? Like you were remembering someone else's memories? Tell me in the comments, because I still wonder sometimes if Lydia's ghost reached out to warn me, or if some part of her consciousness merged with mine during those days on the ship. leaving traces that will never completely fade. My name is Arya. I'm 26 years old, and I work as an IT consultant based out of Boston. In April 2022, I booked a Mediterranean cruise on the MSC Meraviglia, departing from Barcelona. The trip was partly vacation and partly remote work. Since my company had gone fully flexible after the pandemic and I could technically work from anywhere with decent internet, I'd splurged on bringing my entire tech setup: laptop, tablet, portable monitor, noise-canceling headphones, even my smartwatch and fitness tracker. I'm the kind of person who feels naked without at least 3 devices within arm's reach. So the idea of a cruise with limited connectivity made me nervous. But the Mediterranean itinerary was too good to pass up. My cabin was an inside room on Deck 5, number 5678, small but functional. I'd chosen it specifically because it was near the ship's business center and supposedly had the most stable internet connection of the inside cabins. The first 2 days were perfect. I worked in the mornings, explored ports in the afternoons, and actually managed to maintain my usual productivity while enjoying the travel experience. I felt like I'd discovered the perfect work-life balance. Then my devices started betraying me. It began on day 2 with a notification on my phone. I was walking back to my cabin after breakfast when my screen lit up with a location alert. "You have arrived at Deck 12 pool." Except I was on Deck 5, nowhere near the pool, and I deliberately turned off location services before boarding because I didn't want apps draining my battery with constant GPS tracking. I checked my settings, and sure enough, location services were off. The notification shouldn't have been possible. An hour later, another alert. "You are now at Windjammer Buffet, Deck 14. I was in my cabin working on a project deadline, hadn't left the room in over 2 hours. I dismissed it as a glitch, maybe the ship's Wi-Fi system interfering with my phone sensors. Tech malfunctions happen, especially in the metal-enclosed environment of a cruise ship where signals bounce strangely. But then my laptop started displaying alerts I'd never configured. Pop-up notifications about my movements throughout the ship, accurate to the minute. Departed cabin 5678 at 8:47. Entered Deck 7 promenade at 9:13. Remained in entertainment lounge for 47 minutes. Each notification was time-stamped and precise, tracking my location even when my laptop was closed and supposedly asleep in my cabin. I'm an IT professional. I know my way around computer systems, security settings, and privacy controls. I went through every piece of technology I'd brought, checking for malware, unauthorized apps, anything that might explain the tracking. Everything appeared clean. No suspicious programs, no weird permissions granted, nothing that should be monitoring my location with this level of detail. That evening, I was having dinner in one of the main dining rooms when my tablet, which I'd left charging in my cabin, started playing audio through my headphones. Except my headphones were in my ears, connected to my phone, playing music. The audio coming through was a recording of a conversation I'd had earlier that day with another passenger about shore excursions. A private conversation, held on Deck 10, nowhere near my cabin or any of my devices. Crystal clear audio, like someone had been standing right next to us with a professional microphone. My appetite disappeared. I went straight back to my cabin and found my tablet on the desk, screen displaying a live feed of the corridor outside my door. Not a security camera feed, but my tablet's own camera, somehow transmitting despite the camera cover I'd physically placed over the lens. I ripped the cover off and found the camera underneath was active, the little green light glowing. I shut down every device, powered everything completely off, and sat on my bed trying to think rationally. Someone had accessed my technology. Someone with serious technical skills had hacked into my personal devices and was surveilling me. But how? My equipment was encrypted, password protected, running updated security software. This wasn't some casual privacy breach. This was sophisticated, targeted, and deeply invasive. The ship's phone in my cabin rang, making me jump. The old-fashioned landline built into the wall, the kind I'd never used because who makes phone calls anymore when you can text? I picked it up hesitantly. No one spoke, but I could hear breathing. Then keyboard typing sounds, rapid and rhythmic. And then a voice, distorted through some kind of filter that made it sound mechanical and inhuman. You have interesting security protocols, Araya. Watching you try to find my access points has been entertaining. You're better than most, but not better than me. My hand was shaking. Who is this? How are you accessing my devices? More typing sounds. The ship's smart cruise system uses facial recognition, RFID tracking in cruise cards, sensors throughout every public space. Passengers think it's convenient. They don't realize how much data the system collects. And they certainly don't realize that someone with the right access can weaponize all that convenience. You work for the ship? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while my mind raced through possibilities. I work through the ship, the voice corrected. The system is my playground. Your devices are just particularly fun toys because you brought so many. Most passengers have a phone and maybe a tablet. You brought an entire mobile office. So many entry points, so many cameras and microphones. You made this very easy for me. The call disconnected. I immediately went to unplug the cabin phone, but before I could reach it, my laptop powered on by itself. The screen displayed security camera footage from throughout the ship, cycling through different locations every few seconds. The pool deck, the casino, the gym, the theater, and then my own cabin, viewed from an angle that showed me standing in the middle of the room, staring at my laptop screen in horror. There was no camera in my cabin. There couldn't be. I checked every inch when I first arrived, standard security practice for someone in my field. But somehow, I was being filmed in real time from a perspective that suggested a camera mounted in the smoke detector above my bed. Text appeared on my laptop screen. You're looking for the camera. There isn't one. I'm using your laptop's camera, triangulated with your tablet's camera and your phone's camera. 3 angles processed through facial recognition software to create a 3-dimensional mapping of your location. Clever, isn't it? I grabbed all 3 devices and threw them into the bathroom, slamming the door. My smartwatch buzzed on my wrist. That won't help. I can hear you through the watch microphone. I can track your heart rate. I know you're terrified. Your pulse is 127 beats per minute. I ripped the watch off and smashed it against the desk. The screen cracked but kept displaying my biometric data, updating in real time even though it was no longer on my wrist. Somehow, it was still pulling data from somewhere, still connected to whatever network this person had created. I ran out of my cabin and went straight to the ship's security office. The officer on duty was a woman in her 30s who listened to my story with increasing concern. She called her supervisor, and within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a conference room with 3 members of the ship's security team and one of their IT specialists. I explained everything. The tracking notifications, the audio recordings, the phone call, the camera feeds. They took me seriously, which was a relief, and immediately started investigating. The IT specialist, a guy named Ander, who looked barely old enough to drink, started running diagnostics on the ship's network while security reviewed access logs. What they found was worse than I'd imagined. Someone had installed unauthorized backdoor access to the ship's entire smart cruise system weeks ago during a routine software update in port. The access was sophisticated enough that it hadn't triggered any security alerts. From that back door, The person had been monitoring hundreds of passengers, collecting data, tracking movements, accessing any personal device that connected to the ship's Wi-Fi. But my devices had been specifically targeted. While other passengers were being passively monitored, I was being actively stalked. Someone was spending hours focused specifically on me, recording my conversations, tracking my every movement, sending me messages designed to terrorize. Ander managed to trace some of the unauthorized access attempts back to their source. The activity was coming from someone using ship computers, someone with intimate knowledge of the cruise line systems. Security pulled employment records and cross-referenced with technical access, permissions. They identified a contractor named Porter, who'd been part of the technology installation team when the ship was being outfitted with its smart cruise system 2 years ago. Porter had left the company 6 months ago, supposedly to pursue other opportunities, but he'd maintained access to remote system administration tools. And according to his employment file, he'd previously been fired from another cruise line for what was described as inappropriate interest in guest privacy. I felt sick. This wasn't a random hacker. This was someone with a pattern, someone who specifically targeted people on cruise ships, because the combination of isolated location and integrated technology systems created the perfect environment for his stalking. Security tried to lock Porter out of the systems, but he was better than they were. Every time Ander closed one access point, Porter opened another. My laptop suddenly displayed a message. "You think involving ship security will stop me? I've been inside these systems for 2 years. I know every vulnerability, every workaround, every backup route. You can't keep me out." Then all the screens in the security office started displaying feeds. Not from ship cameras, but from passenger devices. Dozens of feeds, hundreds maybe, showing people in their cabins, in bathrooms, in private moments they thought were protected. Porter had been collecting this footage for months, maybe years. The scale of the violation was staggering. Ander's face had gone white. "He's threatening to release all of this publicly unless we back off. He's saying he'll dump everything to the internet, ruin lives, destroy the cruise line's reputation." But Porter made a mistake. In his arrogance, in his desire to demonstrate his control, he opened too many connections simultaneously. Anders saw the pattern, tracked the data flow, and managed to identify Porter's physical location. He wasn't on the ship. He was remote accessing everything from his apartment in Miami, sitting at home while terrorizing people at sea. Ander managed to lock down the ship's systems completely, cutting off all external access and isolating the network. It meant passengers lost Wi-Fi and internet connectivity, which caused complaints. But it also meant Porter was shut out. Security contacted FBI Cyber Crimes Division, since the criminal activity crossed international waters and involved United States citizens. They coordinated with Miami police to arrest Porter at his apartment. The technical forensics revealed the full scope of his crimes. Porter had been stalking passengers on 12 different cruise ships across multiple cruise lines, always targeting people who brought extensive technology with them, people who were digitally connected and therefore vulnerable to his particular brand of surveillance. He'd been collecting footage, building files on hundreds of victims, and in several cases had used the information to blackmail people after their cruises ended. I was victim number 47 in his digital collection. He'd chosen me because my professional profile indicated I'd bring quality equipment and would be likely to notice his presence, which he found exciting. The game of cat and mouse, proving he was better than someone who worked in IT, that was part of what motivated him. Porter was arrested without incident and eventually convicted on federal cyber-stalking charges, unauthorized access to computer systems, voyeurism, and multiple counts of harassment. The evidence was overwhelming. He's serving 15 years in federal prison, and he's banned from accessing internet-connected devices for life after his release. MSC overhauled their entire security infrastructure after the incident. They brought me in as a paid consultant to help identify vulnerabilities and implement better protections. I've worked with 3 other cruise lines since then, developing maritime-specific cybersecurity protocols. What happened to me led to industry-wide changes in how cruise ships handle passenger data and device connectivity. But I'm different now. I don't bring my laptop on vacations anymore. I use a basic phone without smart features. I cover every camera on every device I own. I check hotel rooms and rental properties for hidden surveillance equipment. And I've become an advocate for digital privacy rights, speaking at conferences about the intersection of technology and personal safety. The weird thing is, sometimes I still get phantom notifications. My current phone, which Porter never had access to, occasionally displays location alerts that shouldn't be possible. My laptop sometimes shows me in places I'm not. Tech support insists it's just glitches, quirks in GPS systems and location services. But I know better. I know how deep someone skilled can burrow into your digital life. And I know that once your privacy has been violated at that level, you never quite feel safe again. Have you ever felt like your devices were watching you? Like the technology that's supposed to serve you had turned against you? Have you ever wondered who might be on the other side of your camera, listening through your microphone, tracking your digital footprint? Share your experiences in the comments. Because in our connected world, the line between convenience and surveillance is thinner than most people realize. My name is Thea. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 40 years teaching elementary school music in Portland, Maine before I retired. In November 1998, my husband Albert and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary with a Caribbean cruise on the Disney Fantasy, departing from Port Canaveral. It was Albert's idea, really. He'd always wanted to see the islands, and though Disney cruises were known for being family-oriented with lots of children around, we didn't mind. I'd spent my entire career around kids, and their energy and joy had always been something I found comforting rather than annoying. We had a beautiful balcony cabin on Deck 10, number 10234, with a view of the ocean that took my breath away every morning. The first day was magical in the way that only the beginning of a long-awaited vacation can be. We explored the ship, attended the welcome reception, and fell asleep that night, listening to the gentle sound of waves against the hull. I woke up on our second night to singing. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. Children's voices, harmonizing in a haunting melody that seemed to come from just outside our cabin door. But as I surfaced into full consciousness, I realized the sound was real. I could hear it clearly through the walls, a sea shanty sung in perfect pitch by what sounded like a dozen young voices. The lyrics were old-fashioned, archaic English that I couldn't quite follow. Something about the deep and feeding and endless water. I got out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Albert, and went to the door. Through the peephole, I could see the corridor outside, brightly lit and completely empty. No children, no adults, no one at all. But the singing continued, clear as anything, coming from directly outside our room. When I opened the door, the singing stopped immediately. The hallway was silent except for the ambient hum of the ship's ventilation system. I stood there in my nightgown, feeling foolish, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I noticed the smell. Salt and seaweed, much stronger than it should be this far above the waterline, mixed with something organic and decaying, like tide pools left too long in the sun. I went back inside and tried to sleep, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Albert snored peacefully beside me, oblivious, and I envied him that. I lay awake until dawn, listening for the singing to return, but it didn't. The next day, we had a port stop in Cozumel. While Albert browsed a shop selling Mexican silver jewelry, I wandered into a small market where local vendors sold handmade crafts and tourist trinkets. An elderly woman at one of the stalls caught my eye, gestured me over with urgent intensity. She looked at me with an expression that was part concern, part fear, and asked in heavily accented English if I was staying on the big ship in the harbor. When I said yes, her face went pale. She asked if I'd heard children singing at night. The specificity of the question shocked me. I nodded, unable to form words, and she gripped my wrist with surprising strength. She told me a story about a merchant ship that sank near these waters in 1893, carrying orphans from England to families in America. The ship went down in a storm, and all 47 children drowned. Local legend said their spirits remained, singing to ships that passed through their waters, trying to lure passengers to join them beneath the waves. She said the singing was a warning and an invitation, and that I should be very careful not to follow the voices if I heard them again. I thanked her, more disturbed than I wanted to admit, and rejoined Albert. I didn't tell him about the conversation. He would have dismissed it as local superstition designed to unsettle tourists, and maybe he would have been right. But that night, when the singing started again at 3 a.m, I couldn't shake the woman's words from my mind. This time the voices were louder, more insistent. They were singing the same melody, but I could make out more of the lyrics. Something about a teacher, about music, about joining the eternal choir. The words seemed directed at me specifically, as if the singers knew who I was and what I did for a living. Albert woke this time, groggy and confused. He asked what I was listening to, and I realized he could hear it too. That almost made it worse, knowing I wasn't imagining it. We both went to the door, looked through the peephole together, and saw nothing. But when Albert opened the door this time, I grabbed his arm to stop him. The singing continued in the empty corridor, and I had the terrible certainty that if we stepped outside, if we tried to find the source, something awful would happen. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to children sing about drowning and darkness and the peace of the deep water. Then, as suddenly as it started, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Over the next few days, I started seeing them. Not clearly, never directly, just glimpses in mirrors and reflections in the windows. Pale faces, children dressed in old-fashioned sailor uniforms from another century. They appeared in the background of photos other passengers took, blurry and indistinct, but definitely there. I'd see them standing at the ship's bow when I walked the deck in the morning, groups of 5 or 6, always watching me with dark, hollow eyes. Other passengers began mentioning similar experiences. A couple from Ohio said they'd heard children singing outside their cabin. A family from Texas reported seeing strange figures in Victorian-era clothing near the lifeboats. A woman traveling alone said she'd found wet footprints, small and child-sized, leading from the pool deck to her cabin door, even though the pool had been closed for hours. The ship's crew dismissed these reports as overactive imaginations, the power of suggestion on a vessel, where so many children were present anyway. But I could tell some of them were unsettled. I noticed crew members making signs against evil when they thought passengers weren't looking. I saw them avoiding certain areas of the ship after dark. On our 6th night, I made the mistake of going to the Deck 4 lifeboat station alone. I'd been having trouble sleeping, plagued by dreams of drowning, and I thought fresh air might help. It was nearly 3 in the morning, and the deck was deserted. I stood at the railing, looking out at the black water. And that's when I felt them. Small hands taking mine, cool and damp like they'd just come from the ocean. I looked down and saw nothing. But I could feel the pressure of tiny fingers interlaced with my own, pulling gently but insistently toward the railing. The singing started again, all around me now, voices coming from every direction. They were singing in English this time, clear and heartbreaking. "Come play with us, teacher. Teach us your songs. Join our choir below. We've been waiting so long for a music teacher. We want to learn. We want to sing forever." I tried to pull away, but the invisible hands held firm. More hands touched my back, pushing, urging me forward. I was standing on my toes now, leaning over the railing, looking down at the water 70 feet below. The surface of the ocean seemed to ripple and change, and I saw faces looking up at me. Dozens of children treading water, their mouths open in song, their eyes pleading and desperate and utterly mad. The taste of salt water filled my mouth, even though I was on the deck, completely dry. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt full of ocean, heavy and burning, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I went over that railing, I would join them. I would become part of their eternal choir, singing in the deep forever, trying to lure other teachers, other musicians, other people who understood the language of song. Albert found me. I don't know how he knew where I was, or what made him wake up and come looking. But suddenly he was there, grabbing me around the waist, pulling me back from the railing. The moment his arms wrapped around me, the hands released. The singing transformed into shrieking, high-pitched and angry, the sound of children denied something they desperately wanted. He dragged me back to our cabin while I coughed up water that shouldn't have been in my lungs. A ship's officer found us, responding to the commotion, and took us to the medical center. They couldn't explain the water I'd expelled, the way my clothes were damp with salt spray despite the calm night, or the small bruises on my wrists that looked exactly like handprints from children's fingers. We disembarked at the next port and flew home early, abandoning the cruise with 4 days remaining. The cruise line was understanding, refunded our money without argument. Which made me think this wasn't the first time passengers had left their ships under similar circumstances. Years have passed since that voyage. Albert died 5 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, and I miss him every day. I moved to Arizona after his death, to my daughter's house in Phoenix, as far from the ocean as I could get. I can't live near water anymore. Even lakes make me anxious. Swimming pools give me panic attacks. But every year, on November 17th, I hear them. It doesn't matter where I am or what I'm doing. At 3 in the morning, I wake to the sound of children singing sea shanties in my bedroom. I don't see them anymore, but I hear them clearly, their voices as pure and haunting as they were that night on the Disney fantasy. I looked up the date later, did research at the local library. November 17th, 893, was when the orphan ship went down. The historical records confirmed it. A merchant vessel called the Britannia, carrying 47 orphan children from Liverpool to New York, sank in a Caribbean storm. All the children drowned. Their bodies were never recovered. The newspaper accounts from the time said that several crew members survived and reported hearing the children singing as the ship went down, maintaining their courage through music even as the water rose around them. The survivors said it was the most beautiful and terrible sound they'd ever heard, and it haunted them for the rest of their lives. I understand that haunting now. I carry it with me every day. And on November nights, when the singing starts, I lie very still in my bed and I don't move toward the sound. I don't try to find its source. I know what they want, and I know I can never give it to them, no matter how much they plead. Because joining their choir would mean drowning forever, suspended in cold, dark water, singing the same songs for eternity, trying to lure other musicians to share our fate. And while part of me understands their loneliness, their desperate desire for a teacher who can help them make beautiful music together, the living part of me knows that some invitations must always be refused. Have you ever heard something calling to you that you knew you shouldn't answer? Have you ever felt pulled toward something dangerous that disguised itself as beautiful? Tell me about the times when your instincts screamed at you to resist, because sometimes the most haunting melodies are the ones we must refuse to sing. My name is Aisha. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a major drug company based in Chicago. In August 2020, during that strange period when cruise lines were just starting to operate again after the pandemic shutdown, I booked a Caribbean cruise on the Carnival Horizon departing from Miami. I needed to get away from my apartment where I'd been trapped for months, and the cruise line was advertising heavily sanitized environments and strict health protocols. It seemed safe enough, and after months of isolation, I was desperate for any kind of change. My cabin was an inside room on Deck 7, number 7891. Nothing fancy but adequate for the week-long voyage. The ship felt strange with only half capacity, lots of empty spaces and masked crew members constantly wiping down surfaces. There was an eerie quality to it, like we were passengers on a ghost ship pretending everything was normal when clearly nothing was. On the second day, I started noticing an elderly man who seemed to be everywhere I went. He looked to be in his 70s, always wearing the same dark cardigan despite the tropical heat. And he had this way of staring at people that made my skin crawl. Not a casual glance, but intense observation, like he was studying specimens under a microscope. His eyes would linger on the younger passengers, the ones who looked healthy and energetic. And there was something calculating in his expression that I couldn't quite identify, but instinctively distrusted. I first became aware of him near the medical center. I'd gone past it on my way to the pool deck, and he was standing in the corridor just outside, watching people walk by. When I made eye contact accidentally, he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Cold, clinical. He introduced himself as Gunner and said he was traveling alone, that he found people watching to be the most interesting activity on cruises. His palm when we shook hands was ice cold, and the texture felt wrong, waxy and artificial, like touching a mannequin instead of human skin. The interaction left me unsettled enough that I mentioned it to another solo traveler I'd met at breakfast, a guy around my age named Shane, who was taking a break from his accounting job in Boston. Shane laughed it off, said cruise ships always attracted eccentric elderly people with nothing better to do than make younger passengers uncomfortable. But the next time I saw Shane, at the lifeboat drill that afternoon, Gunner was positioned close to us. And when the drill ended, he reached out and touched Shane's shoulder, supposedly to ask a question about the safety procedures. Shane flinched like he'd been shocked. He told me quietly that Gunner's hand had been unnaturally cold, even through his shirt. And something about the contact made his skin crawl. We tried to move away quickly, but Gunner's eyes followed us as we left. That same analytical stare, like he was taking mental notes about our reactions. That evening at dinner, I saw Gunner seated 3 tables away, and I caught him staring at Shane multiple times throughout the meal. Not in a romantic way, but with focused intensity that made me progressively more uncomfortable. When Shane got up to use the restroom, Gunner's gaze tracked him across the entire dining room, never wavering, never blinking. The next morning, Shane looked terrible. We'd planned to meet at the gym, but when he showed up, his skin had a grayish undertone I'd never seen on anyone before. His movements seemed stiff and mechanical, like he was operating his body manually rather than instinctively. When I asked if he was okay, he said he'd woken up feeling strange, like something fundamental had shifted inside him. But he couldn't explain what. By afternoon, the change was more pronounced. Shane's eyes had developed a flatness, like looking at a photograph rather than a living person. We sat at a bar on the pool deck, and when the bartender accidentally made his drink wrong, Shane didn't react at all. He just drank it mechanically, without tasting, without noticing. When I pointed out the mistake, he looked at me with those flat eyes and said, taste didn't matter anymore, that physical sensations were becoming less relevant. That's when I knew something was deeply wrong. Over the next day, I started noticing other passengers developing similar symptoms. A woman who'd been vibrant and talkative at breakfast became quiet and mechanical by dinner. A couple who'd been affectionate on the first day now moved in perfect synchronization, but without any emotional connection. And every single one of them, I realized with growing horror, had been touched by Gunnar at some point. A hand on the shoulder, a brief contact during conversation, a seemingly accidental brush in a corridor. I started avoiding him obsessively, changing my routine, taking different routes through the ship, eating at odd hours. But it was impossible to completely escape on a vessel with limited space. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to be wherever I was. The observation deck at sunrise when I tried to watch the ocean alone. The late-night buffet when insomnia drove me from my cabin. The library when I sought a quiet place to read. Always there, always watching with those calculating eyes. On the fourth night, I couldn't sleep. The anxiety of being stalked, of watching Shane and others transform into something inhuman, had destroyed any sense of safety. I was walking the corridors at nearly 3 a.m. when I heard sounds coming from a restricted crew area on deck 3. Mechanical noises, rhythmic and precise, accompanied by chemical smells that didn't belong on a cruise ship. Formaldehyde, something organic and rotting. The metallic scent of blood mixed with ozone. I knew I shouldn't investigate. Every survival instinct screamed at me to walk away. But I needed to understand what was happening, needed to confirm the terrible suspicions that had been building in my mind. I found a door that had been left slightly ajar, maintenance access that should have been locked, and through the gap I could see into what looked like an unauthorized medical facility. There were examination tables with people on them, passengers I recognized from around the ship. They were unconscious or sedated, their bodies opened in ways that made bile rise in my throat. But they weren't bleeding normally. Instead, their organs were being replaced with artificial substitutes, mechanical components and bioengineered tissue that pulsed with dark, oily substances spreading through their veins like contamination. Gunnar was there, wearing surgical scrubs, working with precision on one of the bodies. But his appearance had changed. The elderly mask had slipped, revealing something underneath that was partially mechanical, partially organic, with structures that violated every law of human biology. He had gills along his neck, webbed tissue connecting his fingers when he spread them, and his eyes reflected light like a deep-sea predator's. I must have gasped because he looked up directly at me. Our eyes met through that gap in the door, and his expression shifted to something that might have been pleasure. "Aisha," he said, and his voice was layered now, multiple frequencies speaking simultaneously. "You're more observant than most. The best subjects always are, the ones who notice the patterns before the transformation completes. though noticing doesn't prevent anything, unfortunately for you. I ran. No thought, just pure animal panic, feet pounding against polished floors as I fled through corridors. Behind me, I heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving with mechanical precision. The transformed passengers, I realized, were hunting me. I found Shane in a corridor on deck 5. He was standing perfectly still, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes had that same reflective quality Gunnar's possessed. When he spoke, his voice had that terrible layered sound. "The transformation is nearly complete for this group," Shane said. But it wasn't really Shane anymore. The body is merely a vessel. We're improving the design, making humans suitable for environments they couldn't previously survive. You should be grateful. Evolution takes millennia. We're offering it in days. Behind him, more transformed passengers emerged from stairwells and cabins. Maybe 20 of them, all moving in perfect synchronization, all with that same oily darkness visible beneath the translucent patches of skin that shouldn't exist on human bodies. I ran to the nearest phone and called ship security, screaming about medical emergencies and passengers being attacked. The officer who responded thought I was hysterical at first. But when he arrived and saw the transformed passengers moving through corridors with inhuman coordination, everything changed. The ship's captain made an emergency decision to divert to Jamaica and called for immediate assistance. Security tried to contain the situation, but Gunnar's plan had been more extensive than anyone realized. Nearly 50 passengers had been infected with his bioengineered parasite, creating a hive consciousness he controlled. In the chaos, Gunnar and most of the transformed passengers escaped overboard. They went over the railings on multiple decks simultaneously, a coordinated evacuation into Caribbean waters where they disappeared. The ship's searchlights found nothing, but not all escaped. Shane was one of 7 transformed passengers detained by security before they could reach the water. Medical teams from the Jamaican Coast Guard treated our ship like a biological contamination site, coming aboard in hazmat suits with equipment I'd never seen before. They tried to remove the parasite from Shane and the others. The surgery took hours. Even with the best intervention, the damage was catastrophic. The organism had integrated too deeply, replacing too much original tissue. Shane survived physically, but he's never been the same. He has chronic health issues requiring constant treatment, and his personality is fundamentally altered, flatter, like essential parts of who he was got lost when they removed the thing that had been rewriting his neural pathways. The investigation revealed Gunnar wasn't his real name. His actual identity was never established. He'd boarded with documentation that appeared legitimate, but was completely fabricated. Intelligence agencies got involved, suspecting bioterrorism or illegal human experimentation. They found evidence he'd done this before on at least 3 other cruise ships over the past 2 years, always during the pandemic restart chaos when oversight was minimal. Passenger manifests showed patterns of unexplained illnesses, followed by people vanishing overboard, presumably joining whatever colony Gunnar was building beneath the waves. I spent months in therapy dealing with what I'd witnessed. I left pharmaceutical sales because I couldn't separate legitimate medicine from the nightmare of biological manipulation I'd seen. I work in accounting now, the most boring landlocked job I could find. But I have nightmares about the ocean, about colonies of transformed humans in underwater environments, breeding and spreading. Sometimes I wonder if Gunnar is still out there, still boarding ships, still improving passengers who don't understand what they're accepting when they allow his touch. The cruise line settled with victims under strict non-disclosure agreements. The official story was a norovirus outbreak requiring emergency medical intervention. The truth was buried under corporate liability and government classification. I can't swim anymore. Can't even take baths, only quick showers. I moved to Denver, far from any ocean, and I checked news obsessively for reports of unusual cruise ship illnesses or mysterious passenger disappearances. Shane doesn't talk about his transformation. When I've asked, he says memories are fragmented, like they belong to someone else. But sometimes I catch him staring at bodies of water with an expression of longing that terrifies me, like part of him wants to return to whatever hive consciousness Gunnar connected him to. I know Gunnar is still out there, still experimenting, still transforming people into something designed for environments humans can't naturally survive. And the worst part is wondering if maybe he believes he's helping. If maybe in his alien logic, he's offering evolution, when really he's just stealing everything that makes us human and replacing it with something that breathes underwater, but has no soul. Have you ever had someone touch you and felt like they left contamination you couldn't wash away? Have you ever looked at someone familiar and known with absolute certainty they'd been replaced by something wearing their face? Share your experience, because the most terrifying predators are often the ones who convince you they're offering improvement when they're really stealing your humanity, one touch at a time. My name is Esme. I'm 44 years old, and I work as an astrophysics professor at a university in Seattle. In July 2024, I booked a solo trip on the Royal Caribbean Quantum of the Seas for an Alaska cruise departing from Vancouver. The timing was deliberate. I'd been researching circadian rhythm disruptions at extreme northern latitudes, studying how the extended daylight of Alaskan summers affects human sleep patterns and temporal perception. The cruise offered a perfect opportunity to collect data, while also getting away from the pressures of academic life for 2 weeks. I'd brought extensive recording equipment, notebooks, and measurement tools, planning to document my own physiological responses to the changing light conditions. My cabin was a balcony room on Deck 9, number 9445, with a view of the ocean that I'd specifically requested for observational purposes. I wanted to watch the water at different times of day, to see how light reflected off the surface as we moved north into regions where the sun barely set during peak summer. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I established baseline measurements, recorded sleep quality, monitored my own alertness levels, and felt that particular satisfaction that comes from well-designed research proceeding according to plan. On day 3, I met another solo traveler named Julieta. She was sitting alone in the observation lounge on Deck 14, staring out at the ocean with an expression that was hard to read. Something about her posture, the intensity of her focus, made me curious. I approached and asked if the seat next to her was taken. She looked at me with eyes that were simultaneously exhausted and hyper-alert, like someone who'd been awake for days but couldn't allow themselves to rest. She asked if I'd noticed anything strange about the ship. The question was so direct, so oddly specific, that I almost laughed it off as a joke. But something in her tone made me pause. I admitted that I'd been experiencing unusually strong déjà vu since boarding, moments where I felt certain I'd already lived through specific interactions and events. She nodded like this confirmed something she'd been suspecting. Julieta told me she'd been on this exact cruise before. Not a similar itinerary, but this specific sailing. The Quantum of the Seas, Alaska route, departing Vancouver in July. She said she'd been trapped in some kind of temporal loop for what felt like months, maybe longer. She'd lost accurate count of how many times she'd experienced these same 2 weeks. Every time the ship docked back in Vancouver at the end of the cruise, she'd wake up in her cabin on embarkation day, and the entire voyage would start over. My first instinct as a scientist was skepticism. Temporal loops were theoretical constructs, mathematical possibilities in physics equations, not actual phenomena people experienced in daily life. But Giulietta started describing things that hadn't happened yet in my timeline. She told me that in exactly 12 minutes, a crew member would drop a tray of glasses in the corridor outside the lounge. She told me what I'd order for lunch, which I hadn't decided yet. She told me about a minor mechanical issue that would be announced tomorrow morning, describing the captain's exact wording. Everything she predicted came true with unsettling accuracy. We spent the next several hours in that lounge while she explained her theory. She believed something about this particular route, these specific coordinates in the northern Pacific, created a fold in space-time. The ship crossed the same path repeatedly, and somehow that repetition had actual temporal consequences. She and I, and possibly others, were caught in awareness of the loop while the rest of the passengers and crew experienced it linearly, oblivious to the repetition. As she spoke, I started having memories that didn't fit my personal timeline. I remembered conversations we'd had that we'd never actually had. I remembered visiting ports we hadn't reached yet. I remembered a storm that was scheduled for day 8, complete with specific details about the ship's movements and announcements. The memories felt as real as anything else in my past, but they existed in a space outside normal causality. That night, I barely slept. The temporal displacement, if that's what it was, created a profound disorientation. I kept having dreams that felt more like memories. Different versions of this cruise, slight variations in events. In one memory dream, I'd chosen the early dinner seating instead of late. In another, I'd booked an inside cabin instead of balcony. But always the same route, always the same ship, always the same underlying feeling of being observed by something vast and patient. Giulietta found me at breakfast the next morning and asked if I'd experienced the memory bleeding. That's what she called it, the way memories from other iterations started infiltrating your current experience. I confirmed that yes, I was remembering things that hadn't happened yet, or had happened in timelines I shouldn't have access to. She said it gets worse the longer you're aware. The boundaries between iterations blur. You start losing track of which version of events is your actual present and which are echoes from loops that haven't occurred yet in your subjective experience. Over the next few days, more passengers began showing signs of awareness. A retired couple mentioned persistent déjà vu. A businessman said he kept having prophetic dreams. A college student swore she'd lived this week before. Giulietta kept a notebook documenting everyone who seemed to be breaking through into awareness, tracking whether the pattern held consistent across iterations. But what disturbed me most wasn't the human element. It was the ship itself. Once you started paying attention with the mindset of someone looking for temporal anomalies, you noticed things. The engine vibrations followed a pattern that felt intentional, almost communicative. I spent an evening with my recording equipment capturing the rhythms, and when I analyzed them later using basic signal processing, I found structure. The pattern repeated every 47 seconds, and within that repetition was information encoded in a way that resembled Morse code. I spent hours translating it, checking my work multiple times because the results seemed too bizarre to be accurate. But the message was consistent. Observe, observe, observe. Repeated endlessly, transmitted through the mechanical vibrations of the ship's propulsion system. I showed my findings to Giulietta. She wasn't surprised. She said she'd noticed it in previous iterations, that the ship itself seemed to be part of whatever was creating the temporal loop. Not the physical vessel, but something using the ship as a medium for observation. On day 9, we reached coordinates that Giulietta had marked in her notebook as significant. She'd spent multiple iterations researching maritime history, and she'd discovered that a luxury liner had disappeared at this exact location in 1952. The ship had vanished without distress call or debris field, 400 passengers and crew simply ceasing to exist in observable reality. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies recovered, just absence where a ship should have been. The quantum of the seas slowed as we passed through that area. Standard procedure for commemorating maritime disasters. I was on my balcony, recording the ocean surface for my research, when gravity stopped functioning correctly. Not completely, but enough to be immediately noticeable. My coffee mug lifted slightly from the table without any force applied. My hair felt lighter, floating in a way that had nothing to do with wind. When I looked down at the water, the perspective was wrong. We appeared to be simultaneously much higher and much lower than our actual position, like viewing the ocean through a lens that bent space as well as light. Then I saw the other ships. Not one or two, but dozens, maybe hundreds. All identical to the quantum of the seas, all occupying the same spatial coordinates without touching, like layers of reality stacked on top of each other with just enough separation to prevent collision. All of them were crossing this exact point at this exact moment. And through the windows and balconies of those other ships, I could see passengers who looked exactly like me, standing in identical positions, staring out at the impossible sight. Giulietta appeared beside me, though I hadn't heard my cabin door open. She looked more tired than any living person should look, and still remained standing. She pointed down at the water and told me to really look, to see past the surface reflection to what lay beneath. I forced my eyes to focus through the visual distortion. Something was rising from the depths. Not slowly, but with the inevitability of continental drift. Something vast enough that what I could perceive was clearly just a tiny fraction of the whole. The visible portion was an eye, though calling it an eye felt inadequate for something that size. It was larger than the ship's entire hull, and it looked directly at us with an intelligence that was utterly alien and completely focused. The geometry of it was wrong in ways that made my nose bleed and my vision blur. Angles connected in configurations that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. Colors existed in spectrums I didn't have names for. Wavelengths that human eyes weren't designed to perceive, but somehow I was seeing anyway. My training in astrophysics had familiarized me with concepts like higher dimensional space and non-Euclidean geometry, but experiencing it directly was completely different from understanding it mathematically. Giulietta spoke quietly beside me, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. She said we were being studied. The entity, or whatever appropriate term existed for something that, massive and incomprehensible, had been dreaming this cruise into existence repeatedly. We were caught in its attention, subjects of observation and analysis. Every time it forgot, we reset. Every time it remembered us, the dream would start over. We were the recurring dream of something vast and eternal, and we had no mechanism to wake up. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously. Time felt elastic, pulling in multiple directions at once. I could taste salt water in my mouth, even though my cabin was completely dry. The air smelled like copper and ozone, like lightning striking metal surfaces. My skin felt simultaneously hot and cold, present and absent, like I existed in multiple states of matter at the same time. Through it all, that enormous eye watched us with patient, endless curiosity. Not malevolent, not even particularly interested in us as individuals. We were data points, specimens, recurring patterns in a dream belonging to something that existed outside normal temporal flow. Then I was waking up in a hotel room in Vancouver. July 2024, embarkation day. My luggage was packed beside the bed, and I had a confirmation email for the Quantum of the Seas Alaska cruise. I had no conscious memory of anything I just described. No recollection of meeting Julieta or seeing the impossible eye beneath the ship, or experiencing the temporal displacement. But in my luggage, underneath my carefully organized research equipment, I found a notebook I didn't remember packing. Page after page of my own handwriting, describing everything in meticulous detail. Warnings to myself, accounts of multiple iterations, mathematical models attempting to explain the temporal mechanics. The most recent entry, time-stamped just hours before according to the date, said, "This is iteration 17. You will not remember. You never do." The entity erases conscious memory when it resets, but muscle memory persists. You always write this down. You always find this notebook. And you always board the ship anyway. Something compels you. Some force or influence makes refusal impossible. Do not board. Please, for once, break the pattern. Do not board. I sat in that hotel room reading my own desperate warnings. I felt the truth of them even without memory to support the claims. Every logical part of my brain, my entire scientific training, my decades of critical thinking, all of it screamed at me to cancel, to fly home immediately, to stay as far from the quantum of the seas as physically possible. But I went to the port anyway. I checked in at the terminal. I boarded the ship. I found cabin 9445 and unpacked my equipment. And as I stood at my balcony window, watching Vancouver disappear behind us, I felt the overwhelming certainty that I'd done this before and would do it again and again and again. The compulsion wasn't external force. It was deeper than that, more fundamental. Like the entity's observation had created a groove in reality, and I was following that groove the way water follows the path of least resistance. Free will existed, but only within parameters established by something operating on scales I couldn't comprehend. I still work at the university in Seattle. I still teach astrophysics and conduct research on circadian rhythms. But every July, I receive a booking confirmation I don't remember making, for an Alaska cruise I have no conscious memory of taking. And every year, despite finding the notebook covered in increasingly desperate warnings, despite the growing sense that something is terribly wrong, I board that ship. Because whatever exists beneath those Pacific waters hasn't finished studying me yet. The dream continues, iteration after iteration, and I'm trapped in the role of recurring character in a narrative I can't escape. My awareness comes and goes. My memory resets with each loop. But somewhere deep in my unconscious mind, in the part of me that survives beyond conscious thought, I'm screaming. I've tried to share this with colleagues, to present it as theoretical research. But the moment I try to discuss the actual experience, the words won't come. Something prevents articulation. I can write it down, as evidenced by the notebooks I keep finding. But speaking about it directly becomes impossible. The entity, or whatever force controls the loop, protects itself through enforced silence. Sometimes I wonder if Julieta is real, or if she's another aspect of the dream, a character the entity created to help me process what's happening. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one truly aware, and everyone else who seems to notice is just part of the pattern, scripted responses designed to make me feel less alone in my observation. The worst part is the erosion of certainty. I can't be sure which iteration this is. I can't know if I'm actually writing this now or if these are false memories implanted by the entity. I can't distinguish between genuine present experience and echoes from loops that technically haven't happened yet in linear time. My entire sense of continuous self has been shattered by the awareness that I'm living the same events repeatedly, with no memory of the repetition. I've considered that maybe this is the purpose. Not scientific observation in any conventional sense, but something more fundamental. Maybe the entity is studying what happens to consciousness when it becomes aware of its own temporal imprisonment. Maybe we're not subjects in a biology experiment, but participants in a philosophical investigation about the nature of identity and memory, and what makes us continuous beings across time. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we're just interesting patterns in a dream, and the dreamer likes watching us enough to dream us again and again, tweaking variables slightly each time to see what changes and what remains constant. Have you ever felt trapped in a routine so repetitive it stopped feeling like choice? Like you were following a script written by someone else? Have you ever had the sensation that you've lived the same day before? Not déjà vu, but actual memory of identical events? Share your experience, because maybe there are others caught in their own loops, their own recurring dreams belonging to entities we can't perceive. And maybe knowing we're not alone makes the imprisonment slightly more bearable. My name is Adelina. I'm 52 years old, and I work as a maritime historian and author specializing in transatlantic crossings and the golden age of ocean liners. In May 2016, I booked passage on the Norwegian Getaway for a positioning cruise from Copenhagen to Boston, a transatlantic route that would take 2 weeks and cross some of the most historically significant shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. The journey was research for my next book about passenger experiences on luxury liners during the 1920s and 30s, and I'd brought extensive documentation with me. Vintage photographs, passenger manifests, and diary entries from that era that I'd collected over years of archival work. My cabin was an ocean view room on Deck 8, number 8567, with a window that looked out over the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic. I'd specifically requested this route because it followed almost exactly the same path that many historic ships had taken, including several famous vessels that had met tragic ends. There was something profound about crossing the same water, following the same coordinates, connecting physically with the history I'd spent my career studying. On the second day at sea, I found something that shouldn't have existed. I was unpacking the last of my research materials, organizing photographs and documents on the small desk in my cabin, when I discovered an antique pocket watch tucked into the inner pocket of my laptop bag. I had no memory of packing it. The watch was beautiful, clearly from the early 20th century, with an ornate gold case and a crystal face that was pristine despite obvious age. When I opened it, I found an engraving inside the cover. RMS Valeria, 1927. The name sent a chill through me. I knew the Valeria. It was one of the ships I'd researched extensively for my book. A luxury liner that had sunk on its maiden voyage in 1927, going down in the North Atlantic during what should have been a routine crossing from Southampton to New York. 412 people had died. The disaster had been overshadowed by more famous sinkings, but it was no less tragic for being less remembered. The watch shouldn't work. It was nearly 90 years old, and pocket watches from that era required regular winding and maintenance. But when I held it up, I could hear it ticking, keeping perfect time, the second hand moving with smooth precision. The glass crystal was flawless, not a scratch or crack visible despite the age. That evening, I heard music, not from the Norwegian Getaway's entertainment venues, but something older, tinnier, the distinctive sound of a gramophone playing big band jazz from the 20s. It was coming from somewhere outside my cabin. But when I opened the door to investigate, the corridor was empty and the music faded immediately. The next morning at dawn, I went up to the observation deck to watch the sunrise. The Atlantic was calm, almost glassy, reflecting pink and orange light in a way that was nearly hypnotic. That's when I saw him. A man standing at the railing about 20 feet away, dressed completely wrong for the current era. He wore a formal tuxedo, the kind with tails that you'd see in photographs from the 20s, and his hair was slicked back in that specific style popular before the Second World War changed men's fashion. He turned when he sensed my presence, and his face was handsome in an old-fashioned way, with sharp features and dark eyes that held a depth of sadness I could feel even at a distance. He smiled, but it didn't reach those eyes, and he approached me with the formal manners of another era. He introduced himself as Joseph and asked about my work. I was too surprised by his appearance to question how he knew I was a writer. We talked for nearly an hour, and he spoke about transatlantic crossings with the intimate knowledge of someone who'd actually experienced them in their heyday. He described details about first-class accommodations, the social rituals of shipboard life, the peculiar culture that developed among passengers during long ocean voyages. Everything he said aligned perfectly with the historical accounts I'd studied, but he spoke about them as lived experience rather than historical facts. When I asked which cabin he was staying in, he gave me a number that corresponded to first-class accommodations on the Valeria, not the Norwegian Getaway. When I pointed this out, he looked confused for a moment. Then his expression cleared, and he said something that made my blood run cold. I was a passenger on the Valeria. I think I'm still there. But I can see you. Why can you see me? I should have walked away. Everything about the situation screamed impossibility, suggested mental illness or elaborate prank. But I'd spent my career immersed in maritime history, and I'd read too many accounts of unexplained phenomena at sea. Too many stories from sailors and passengers who'd experienced things that defied rational explanation. The ocean had always held mysteries that science couldn't fully capture. Over the next several days, Joseph appeared frequently, sometimes on deck, sometimes in the library, once in the dining room where he sat at an empty table watching passengers eat meals he couldn't taste. Other passengers walked through the spaces he occupied without noticing him, without reacting to his presence at all. I was the only person who could see him. He told me his story in fragments, pieces of memory that came back to him gradually. He'd been 28 years old in 1927, traveling to America to start a new life, leaving behind family disappointments and failed business ventures in England. He'd booked first-class passage on the Valeria's maiden voyage, excited about the ship's reputation as the newest and most luxurious liner on the Atlantic. He'd been on deck when the ship struck something in the night. Not an iceberg, he insisted. Something else. Something that moved beneath the water with intention. The Valeria had gone down quickly, much faster than a ship of that size and construction should have sunk. There hadn't been enough lifeboats, and the panic had been absolute. Joseph remembered the water, the shocking cold of it, the way it felt like knives against his skin. He remembered going under, lungs burning, darkness closing in. And then nothing. Just absence, until he found himself back on the ship, or a version of the ship, walking corridors that felt both familiar and wrong. He said he'd been trapped like this for what felt like decades, watching the ocean pass beneath him, unable to leave, unable to die properly, unable to do anything except exist in this liminal state between life and death. He'd seen other ships pass through these waters, modern vessels that looked nothing like the liners of his era, but he couldn't interact with them. He could only watch. Until me. For some reason, I could see him. I could hear him. And he desperately needed me to understand what had happened, to tell his story, to make sure people remembered the Valeria and everyone who died on it. I started researching more intensively, using the ship's limited internet to access historical databases and newspaper archives. What I found disturbed me profoundly. Yosef's story checked out. There had been a passenger named Yosef traveling first class on the Valeria. His photograph appeared in one of the archives, and it was unmistakably the same man I'd been talking to. The resemblance was perfect, down to the way he held his head slightly tilted when he was thinking. But there were other details that didn't match the official narrative. The Valeria's sinking had been attributed to structural failure, a design flaw that caused catastrophic flooding. But survivor testimonies, buried in archives that few people ever read, told different stories. Multiple witnesses reported seeing something in the water before the ship went down. Something large. Something that created waves and disturbances that weren't consistent with normal ocean conditions. Several survivors claimed the ship had been attacked or deliberately sunk, though these accounts had been dismissed as trauma-induced confusion. I showed some of this research to Yosef, and he reacted with visible emotion, tears streaming down translucent cheeks. He said he'd always known the official story was wrong, that the ship hadn't failed on its own, that something had targeted the Valeria specifically. But no one had believed the survivors, and eventually even they stopped believing themselves, convinced by authorities that they'd misremembered in the chaos. On day 10 of the crossing, we reached the coordinates where the Valeria had gone down. I'd calculated them precisely using historical records and modern GPS mapping. The Norwegian getaway slowed as we passed through the area, and I stood on the observation deck with my hand wrapped around the antique pocket watch that had started all of this. The watch was warm against my palm, warmer than it should be, and it was ticking faster, the rhythm accelerating beyond normal timekeeping. Yosef appeared beside me, more solid than I'd ever seen him before, almost completely opaque. He was staring down at the water with an expression of recognition and terror. Something was happening to the ocean. The surface, which had been relatively calm all day, started rippling in patterns that weren't natural. Concentric circles expanding from a central point directly below the ship. Waves moving in geometric precision that waves shouldn't possess. The water's color changed, becoming darker, almost black, like looking into depth that went beyond the normal seabed into something infinite. Then she appeared, not gradually emerging but suddenly present, standing on the deck beside us. A woman in an evening gown from the 20s, her clothes soaked with seawater that dripped constantly onto the deck without leaving puddles. Her face was beautiful, but filled with rage so intense it was almost tangible. A fury that had been burning for 90 years without diminishing. Yosef reacted immediately, his entire posture changing from the friendly openness he'd shown me to defensive fear. He said her name, Rebecca, and I heard in his voice a complicated history of relationship and betrayal. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone he'd known personally, someone he'd wronged. Rebecca spoke, and her voice was layered with water sounds, like words bubbling up from deep below the surface. She told a story I hadn't heard before, one that didn't appear in any historical archive. She and Yosef had been involved, engaged to be married. But Yosef had used her family's money to book his first-class passage, while leaving her with steerage accommodations far below deck. When the Valeria started sinking, when the lifeboats were being loaded with first-class passengers first, Yosef had pushed Rebecca away from a spot on a lifeboat. She'd fallen, been trampled in the panic, and by the time she fought her way back to the deck, all the boats were gone. She drowned in the Atlantic, lungs filling with freezing water, dying slowly while watching Yosef's lifeboat row away from the sinking ship. But death hadn't released her. Her fury, Her sense of betrayal had been so strong that it anchored her to this location, to these coordinates where she'd lost everything. And when Yosef had died years later in 1952, peacefully in his sleep after a full life in America, his spirit had been pulled back to these waters because Rebecca's rage wouldn't release him. She'd been hunting him across time, manifesting on ships that crossed their death site. And now she'd found him again on the Norwegian getaway, because I'd brought the pocket watch. The watch, she explained, had been her gift to him before the voyage, a token of love that had become a cursed object, tying him eternally to the site of his greatest betrayal. I watched this confrontation between ghosts, between people who died decades before I was born, and I understood with terrible clarity that I'd become part of their story. By bringing the watch, by being able to see Yosef, I'd created a bridge between their world and mine. And now I had to witness the resolution of a tragedy that had been playing out for 90 years. Yosef tried to defend himself, tried to explain that he'd been afraid, that survival instinct had overridden everything else, including love and honor. But Rebecca wasn't interested in explanations. She'd waited too long, suffered too much, spent decades bound to this patch of ocean watching ships pass overhead while she remained trapped below. She reached for him, her hands passing through his translucent form, and where she touched him, he started to fade. Not disappearing, but transforming, becoming more liquid, more oceanic, his solid ghost form dissolving into water that dripped to the deck and ran toward the railings. He was screaming, but the sound was muffled, underwater, the cry of someone drowning. I wanted to intervene, but I knew instinctively that I couldn't. This wasn't my story. This was something that had to be resolved between them, a debt that could only be paid in ways I didn't understand. All I could do was bear witness, to make sure someone remembered what happened, to ensure their story didn't disappear completely into the anonymous depths. The watch in my hand grew burning hot, so hot I should have dropped it, but couldn't make my fingers release. Through the crystal face, I saw the hands spinning backward, time reversing. And suddenly, I was seeing something else. The deck of the Valeria superimposed over the Norwegian getaway. I could see both ships simultaneously, different eras occupying the same space, and I understood that we weren't just passing over the site where the Valeria sank. We were passing through a fold in time where that night in 1927 was still happening, would always be happening, perpetually playing out in a loop of tragedy and betrayal. Rebecca and Yosef were fading together now, both becoming translucent, both dissolving into mist that the wind caught and carried out over the dark water. But just before they completely disappeared, Rebecca turned to look at me directly. Her expression had changed, the rage replaced by something else. Not forgiveness, but release. Exhaustion finally giving way to the possibility of rest. She mouthed words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Tell them what really happened. Tell them we're not just forgotten names in old newspapers. Tell them we were real. Then they were gone. Both of them. The ocean returned to normal, the geometric wave patterns dissipating, the darkness in the water fading back to regular Atlantic gray-blue. The watch in my hand stopped burning, and when I looked down at it, the crystal had cracked, a single clean line running from edge to edge. The mechanism inside had stopped, frozen at exactly 2:47 a.m., which, historical records showed, was the approximate time the Valeria had gone under. I kept the watch. I keep it still. Locked in a safety deposit box in Boston because I can't have it in my house. Even broken, even stopped, it feels heavy with history and grief and unfinished business. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it ticking, even though I'm miles away from where it's stored. I wrote about the experience in my book, presenting it as historical narrative rather than personal testimony, because no publisher would accept it as nonfiction without dismissing me as unstable. But I documented everything as accurately as I could, using Rebecca and Yosef's real names, including the testimonies about something attacking the ship, honoring their request to be remembered. The book was published 6 months after the cruise. It sold moderately well, became a minor success in maritime history circles. But I received letters from descendants, people related to passengers who died on the Valeria, thanking me for telling the story with respect and detail. One letter came from a woman in her 80s who identified herself as Yosef's niece. She said her family had always known something was wrong about his survival story, that he'd never spoken about the Valeria after reaching America, that he'd lived the rest of his life consumed by guilt over something he refused to discuss. She thanked me for finally telling the truth, even if I'd presented it as research rather than supernatural testimony. She said knowing what really happened brought closure to family questions that had persisted for 3 generations. I never took another transatlantic cruise. The experience changed something fundamental in how I understand history and memory, and the way trauma can persist across time. I still write about maritime history, but I'm more careful now about which stories I pursue, more respectful of the possibility that the past isn't as settled and finished as we like to believe. Because I know now that certain moments of intense emotion, certain betrayals and deaths and unresolved conflicts don't just disappear into historical archives. They persist. They echo. They wait for someone who can see them, who can hear them, who can finally bear witness and tell the truth. Have you ever felt connected to a historical event you never personally experienced? Like you were remembering someone else's memory? Have you ever held an object that felt heavy with stories it couldn't tell directly, that seemed to carry more weight than its physical mass could explain? Share your experience with objects or places that felt haunted by history. Because sometimes the past reaches out to us through things we touch and places we visit, asking to be remembered, asking to be understood, asking to finally be released from the eternal repetition of trauma. Thank you for joining me on this journey through 10 terrifying accounts of stalking at sea, where the isolation of the open ocean turned dreams of paradise into inescapable nightmares. If these stories resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to Mr. Nightveil, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of documented human experience. Until next time, stay vigilant.